Hello, my name is Sam Feltham. I'm the Director of the Public Health Collaboration and welcome to the PHC Virtual Conference 2020. The coronavirus has changed all of our lives, but where there's an obstacle, there's also an opportunity. And that opportunity comes in the guise of this virtual conference. Earlier this year, we had to postpone our two main events, the annual conference and the Real Food Rocks Festival, until next year. These events allow us to connect, learn and grow, but they also help us raise crucial funds for the PHC to continue. With that in mind, and before we let the next presenter speak, this virtual conference is 100% free for all. But if you find the content valuable today, then please consider donating £2 or whatever you can afford through the Total Giving website via www.phcuk.org/donate. Or if you're in the UK, you can simply text PHC to 70660 to donate £2 directly from your phone. We hope you enjoy the conference from wherever you are in the world, and be sure to get involved in the civil conversation on the comment section here on YouTube or via the hashtag PHCVCon2020 on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. Thanks for your support, take care and stay safe.
Hi, I'm Dr. David Unwin, a GP from the north of England, in a practice where we've been sharing a low-carb approach with our patients for the last 7 years. And I wanted to update you all on what we've been doing. So we're going to just start the presentation now. There we go. So we've been offering the low carb approach now for 7 years, and we've got a fairly detailed data set on nearly 300 patients who very kindly consented to me sharing the data with you. The disclosures, so nobody pays me for anything. I do sometimes accept money for travel, but otherwise everything else is self-funded. And I should say that if you bear with me to the very end of the presentation, there's going to be a free gift for each of you. We should begin by explaining the patient here is showing a skirt that fitted her absolutely about 18 months ago, and it just shows what low carb can achieve. So here's the agenda. We're going to begin with a little bit of revision, low carb in a nutshell. We're going to talk about COVID. I thought you might be interested to know whether men or women lose most weight on the low carb approach. And also, I'm often asked, is it suitable for older people? Then we're going to move on to what happens over time, because we've been using the approach now for 7 years. So we know what happens to people as the time passes by. And then finally, the free gift. So let's begin with the low carb diet in a nutshell. And I should tell you that at the moment, this is achieving a 47% drug-free type 2 diabetes remission at our practice. So of the patients who decide they want the low carb option, 47% of them manage to get their diabetes, their type 2 diabetes into remission, and they're off drugs. So let's just have a look at how we do that. The first thing I should perhaps include is that these are all the practices, the local practices, and that's my practice there, Norwood. And I'd like to point out that if we look here at the spend on anti-diabetic drugs against all the practices in the area, Norwood spends substantially less than all the other local practice on drugs for diabetes. And this is in part a reflection of the approach we've been taking. And in fact, at the moment, we're saving about £50,000 per year on drugs for diabetes alone. In fact, we can look at that in a longer term perspective. So this is data from Open Prescribing, which keeps records on every GP in the country. And if we look at the situation, the latest data was up to November 2019. The spend at Norwood Avenue was £4.50 per patient, whereas in our local area it's £9.57, northwest of England £10, and the UK overall they spend £8.93. So that if every practice had the same spend per patient as Norwood Avenue, there's a potential massive saving there of £266 million that would be spent less on drugs for diabetes if everybody spent the same amount as we do. Let's have a look at what's happened over the years. So this is the trend now from January 2015 to November 2019. So this is the number of items per 1,000 patients. These are items of anti-diabetic medication. So in January 2015, it was 32.3 items. By November, it had dropped. November 2019, it had dropped to 30.6. So that is a decrease of 5% in the number of items of anti-diabetic medication prescribed. And we need to compare that. In the same time frame, there's been a 10% increase in the number of items of anti-diabetic medication prescribed. Looking at the cost per 1,000 patients, the costs at Norwood Avenue have gone up by 17%, but we have to compare that with the national figure, which is an increase of 51%. So I hope in part this is some evidence of what an NHS practice in England can achieve, given some effort and determination. Getting back to the low-carb approach. So it could be said that if you have type 2 diabetes, glucose becomes a sort of metabolic poison. This is perhaps overstating it, but really sugar is not a good food item for somebody with diabetes. And we found in clinical practice that cutting out table sugar is the very first thing somebody with type 2 diabetes should be doing. And in fact, the hemoglobin A1C is really a measure of how sugary your diet has been over the preceding 120 days. I often find a very useful question is to ask patients, where do you think the sugar comes from in your diet? Many people know perfectly well, it's perhaps biscuits or cakes or puddings, and they know to stop that. But so many patients have already given up sugar because they know that's what they should do, and they're a little bit mystified as to where the sugar has come from. And of course, the starch molecule is a clue. So starchy foods like bread, potatoes, are actually made up of glucose molecules holding hands. And of course, digestion breaks that starch back down into the constituent glucose, which explains why somebody who has a lot of potatoes or rice or bread in their diet may well have a high hemoglobin A1C. This is the very basis of the glycemic index. Many of you will have heard of the low GI diet, and that's based on the glycemic index, which ranks carbohydrates into how sugary they are. So obviously on a low carb diet, you would be avoiding carbohydrates with a high GI, or in other words, they're very sugary. This is one of my teaspoons of sugar equivalent charts. I designed these because in the early days, I really struggled to explain to patients the glycemic consequences of different foods they ate. And I think this was because the glycemic load, which is how we normally represent this, talks about grams of glucose. And my patients are not really familiar with either glucose as a substance or grams. So I redid the calculations with the help of Dr. Jeffrey Leavesey, an international expert on the glycemic index. And we reworked the figures in terms of teaspoons of table sugar. So you can see here, 150 grams of boiled basmati rice affects your blood glucose to the same extent as 10 teaspoons of sugar. Or perhaps you might look at 150 grams of boiled potato. Again, this is affecting your blood glucose to the same extent as 9 teaspoons of sugar, and so on. There are actually 7 of these infograms, and I was so proud when they were endorsed by NICE. They're a sort of quality assurance people for the UK, to say that they are a relevant education resource for adults with type 2 diabetes. We're seeing a lot of this fellow at the moment. This is the Right Honourable Matt Hancock, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. And as you see, he endorses my infographics as well. If any of you want to see all 7 of them, they are actually hosted on the Public Health Collaboration website, but here they are actually part of NICE under Tools and Resources, and there they are. That's how you find them. That actually takes you directly to the Public Health Collaboration website from the NICE website. So this is the diet itself. Really, I'm trying to encourage people to give up the white stuff and turn it green, so that instead of having chips or rice with your meal, you would have loads of green veg, perhaps several different types of green veg. And if you remember, going back to the chart, that the glycemic index of green veg is so low compared to potatoes or rice. Also, the glycemic index of meat, fish, eggs is all very, very low. So this makes the basis of the low carbohydrate diet that my patients and myself have been trialing for the last 7 years. So that's the low carb diet in a nutshell. So what about COVID-19? Is a low carb diet relevant to that? So COVID, this is a pulse oximeter measuring oxygen level and pulse there. And I should tell you all that both Jen and I and my son Edward have all had COVID in the last 6 weeks. And it's given us a really personal perspective on how serious COVID is. So this is my son Edward's pulse oximeter. And you see at this point, his oxygen had dropped down from a normal of perhaps 97 or 98 down to 94. And note the pulse, how high it is there. In fact, at his worst, Edward's oxygen level went down to 91 and his pulse up to 150. So Edward was very nearly admitted to hospital and he remained ill, quite ill, for 3 weeks. But I think now of so many thousands of people, tens of thousands of people who were more ill than Edward or Jen or I, who went to hospital, some of them to end up on a ventilator, and some of them never to see their family again. So really, what can we do about COVID? What can each of us do? So we are lucky this is a busy slide, but this is from the University Hospitals of Birmingham and Birmingham University, and it summarized the research, most of it from China, as to what things make a difference for those with COVID. So these are all the various studies, and here are the summary of the comorbidities or the other illnesses which seem to make a difference to outcomes. What surprised me about this was how low the figures for respiratory disease were. I expected respiratory disease to figure highly in the relevant comorbidities, but actually hypertension, high blood pressure, and heart disease and diabetes are far more important, or they seem to be, than respiratory disease. How interesting, how interesting. So when we actually look at the relevant comorbidities, the illnesses that people have that seem to lead to worse outcomes, we should be highlighting, or I would like to highlight, 3 separate areas for action, because so many of you are going to catch COVID in the next few months, and you're surely interested in what you may be able to do to make a difference. So we're going to look at hypertension, type 2 diabetes and hyperglycemia, and obesity. So let's begin with hypertension. So this is a study that I published last year with the help of Professor Brady, a professor of cardiology from Glasgow University. We looked at the figures of the patients at Norwood Avenue to see what had happened to their blood pressure while they were on the low-carb diet. In this case, I think it was for an average of about 2 years. The first thing we noticed was that 20% of all of the patients with high blood pressure who went low carb, we were able to stop their medication. So there was deprescribing of 20% of all the drugs for high blood pressure. Now, despite this, we were still getting significant improvements in blood pressure. These are the average mean improvements in blood pressure. The systolic went down by 11 millimeters of mercury, and the diastolic went down by 6 millimeters of mercury. This is really surprising. And in fact, when we dug back into the relevant papers and the history of this, we've known for at least 20 years that insulin causes renal sodium retention. So that means that somebody with diabetes on a high carb diet is hoarding salt, and the salt puts up their blood pressure. When you go low carb, you actually wee out all that salt. Many of us will have noticed how much urine you produce when you first go low carb, and the blood pressure drops very often in the first month of going low carb. Just as a final point, it just shows how interesting this was to the academic world, because this paper we published ended up in the top 5% of all papers ever published, and there have been 14 million papers published. So the paper has done very well and drawn attention to the world, to this subject of blood pressure and low carb. So what about diabetes? What about diabetes and viral infections? I thought this was very interesting. This is a paper from some years ago, and it concluded that diabetes triples the risk of hospitalization after influenza A and quadruples the risk of intensive care unit administration. So we've known for a while that diabetes is a really relevant factor for viral infections. But then obviously COVID-19 comes along, and this is a paper published very recently where they were looking at what happened. I think these were patients in China, at 7,300 patients with COVID-19 in terms of outcomes. So it was concluded that diabetes status increased the need for medical interventions during COVID. Sadly, diabetes status increased the mortality risk of COVID. But the good news is that well-controlled blood glucose correlated with improved outcomes in infected patients. So that if we compare people with well-controlled diabetes and a lower blood glucose, the survival rate of COVID was 98.9%. The people with poorly controlled blood glucose, poorly controlled diabetes, had a death rate, sadly, of 11%. I think this paper really makes the point that effort in getting good control of diabetes may be really worthwhile in COVID-19. Moving on to obesity. So this is Anna, and this is Anna just over, I think it's about a year and a half ago now. Anna was very heavy, as you can see, but this is Anna now, and she looks fabulous. And Anna's proud and I'm proud. She is the patient who has lost the greatest weight at Norwood Avenue, and it's something like 9 stone or over 50 kilos that she's lost. Quite amazing, and her graph is really a straight line going down and down. And Anna is, I should say, very low carb. But the question is, so here's Anna, that's one patient that's done it, but can we achieve significant weight loss for more patients? So here is the data. This is actually just the data for those with type 2 diabetes at Norwood Avenue. And this was the status at, was in March of this year, when those patients had been on the low-carb diet for an average of 30 months. So we're talking about weight at the moment, and you'll see here the average weight loss for those patients is 9.5 kilos. Interestingly, not everybody loses weight on low carb. And when you look at those who don't lose weight, or a few of them even gained weight, what's interesting is, despite the absence of weight loss for those few people, they still have significant improvements in terms of metabolic health. And I shall be publishing something on that shortly. But we should say that the great majority of people lose weight, and the average weight loss is 9.5 kilos. Just before we finish with Anna's story, I think she would probably really like me to add that one of the problems with modern messaging in terms of carbs is that for people like Anna, moderation in carbohydrates does not work. She tried moderation repeatedly and just got heavier and heavier. And for her, it's because some carbohydrate foods are actually addictive. And the only thing for Anna to do to lose weight successfully is to give up carbs nearly altogether. And so, in fact, she's actually on a well-formulated ketogenic diet. Anyway, now here, while we're looking at the results, and we were thinking about things that made a difference to COVID, so weight was one of them. There's the blood pressure again. If we look at the improvements in terms of hemoglobin A1C, that is the diabetic control for these 143 patients, you'll see that the average improvement in hemoglobin A1C is substantial. So it's 22 millimoles per mole, or 1.9% if you're listening from abroad. This actually achieved drug-free type 2 diabetes remission, so that their hemoglobin A1C was less than 48 millimoles per mole for 68 individuals. And when I think how my journey started with one person who managed to put their diabetes into remission, and now we're seeing type 2 diabetes remission on a weekly basis. So that figure of 68 actually is now 71, because every week we're meeting more people who we're managing to stop their drugs and then normalizing their blood sugar control. A quick look at lipids while we're here. I was often told that going low carb would ruin my patients' lipid profiles, and that this would bring about cardiovascular risk. How interesting now, when the value of keeping data is, I can see that the blood cholesterol, serum cholesterol, has actually gone down. The HD cholesterol, the protective cholesterol, has gone up, and the cholesterol ratio has improved. Look at those triglyceride figures, they've dropped substantially. And the gamma GT is a reflection of the improvements in liver function. So moving on, who loses most weight on a low carb diet, men or women? I know the nurses in the practice were convinced that men lose weight far more easily than women. And yet, as you see, the person who's lost the most weight at Norwood Avenue is Anna, obviously a woman. So let's actually look at the statistics. So this graph shows the two groups. Here are the men and here are the women. And you can see there's the men when they start and when they finish, and the ladies when they start and they finish. There's the average dropping for both groups. So who's losing most weight? Is it the men or the women? I should say the average time on the diet at this point for this graph was 2 years. And the average weight loss for men was 9.5 kilos and for women was 9.4 kilos. So perhaps the men win. I asked my wife Jen, and she says that we should factor in that men start heavier than women. We should compare the average percentage of weight loss by the two sexes, not the absolute weight loss. Well done, Jen. And if you divide the mean loss by the starting weight, men are losing 9.5% of body weight, women are losing 10.1%. So perhaps the women win. So the next person I asked was the statistician, Christine, who's done so much work for me over the years. Here she is. She looked at the two groups, the men and the women, and in fact the conclusion is the p-value between the two is 0.76. What does that mean? It means there is no significant difference between men and women. So it's a draw. Broadly, men and women lose about the same amount of weight. So what about older people? Can they lose weight on a low-carb diet? Well, here is Brian. Brian is over 80, and I'm holding the tape measure there where his waist was 2 years ago. And that's not the only thing that's changed in 2 years. Brian was an insulin-dependent type 2 diabetic on large doses of insulin and drugs for hypertension. He's come off all his medication now and is incredibly well. In fact, recently he was late for an appointment at the practice, and it was because he'd been lifting weights in the gym. I think that's amazing. He's over 80 and he goes to the gym regularly, and look how proud he is. And I'm so proud of him. So what happens to the whole population? So what we did was, this is a graph of all of the people who go low carb in the practice, ranked in increasing age from the youngest at 23 years old to the oldest at 91. Here are the older people at this end, and along the side is the weight loss. So as you see, a few people have gained weight, but there is the weight loss up there. And then the red line there is the trend line. And look, isn't this interesting? So as people get older, the weight loss seems to increase very slightly. So it's really true, and surprised me this, that older people do just as well on the low-carb diet as younger people, and possibly do slightly better. I think that's brilliant, and another message of hope. I used to think that older people had a slower metabolic rate and therefore couldn't lose weight. This really isn't true. I think in part it's because older people take their health very seriously, and they have the time to devote to a good diet, and they get wonderful results, as you see. This is a similar graph. How do older people do in terms of their improvements in hemoglobin A1C? And again, the older people, the people over 65 years of age, are doing just as well as the younger people. Again, this is hopeful, cheerful stuff. So, what happens over time? We're often told it doesn't last, that patients have initial improvements, but then it becomes disappointing. Is that true? Well, this is Chris. This was Chris when I started with him years ago. He weighed nearly 20 stone, and this is Chris now. And this is his hemoglobin A1C in millimoles per mole, and we're going from the year 2009 to 2019. This is where he started on low carb, and he did amazingly very quickly, getting his diabetes into remission. But it's true to say that Chris's results began to deteriorate. So it's true that for many people, there are problems in the early months. Unfortunately, so many clinicians at this point here conclude that the low-carb diet has failed and start medication. Whereas actually what has happened is carb creep. It isn't that the diet is failing, it's that they're not on the diet anymore. So I just said to Chris, at this point, where do you think your sugar has come from? And he said, fair cop, I know where it's come from and I'll do something about it. And look, he did. And the wonderful thing is that the second time he got his diabetes into remission, it was better than the first time because he'd learned stuff. Many of us, as we get older, we learn from our mistakes. Chris learned from his mistakes and has done a far better job. But throughout this time, he's remained off diabetic medications, off statins, and off his medication for diabetes. So there he is. He's in remission again. So maintenance is absolutely key to the low-carb approach. In fact, maintenance is key to any approach that is working for diabetes. We need to support people long-term. We mustn't give up on them. We mustn't leave them alone. They must be able to access help easily. And in fact, this is part of our success at Norwood Avenue, where we're good at supporting people. And if we look here at our type 2 diabetes drug-free remission rates from March 2017 to March 2020, you'll see that over time we're doing better. So in March 2017, the mean duration of the low-carb diet was 13 months. I got 48 patients on the diet, and the number with type 2 diabetes remission was 15, giving a remission rate of 31%. By January 29, the mean duration of the diet was 22 months. I'd got 123 cases on the diet, and 59 had got type 2 diabetes remission. The remission rate had gone up to 47%. The latest data, March 2020, average duration of the diet 30 months, 143, 68 people with type 2 diabetes remission, a remission rate of 47.6%. So the remission rate is going up at Norwood Avenue. And I believe that is because we're good at supporting people. Key to this has been our low-carb groups. So here's the wonderful people of the low-carb group. We've been running these groups for 7 years now. And the point is, anybody can come to one of the groups that's registered at Norwood Avenue without an appointment. We hold them in the evening so that working people can come, so that people can access support so easily. Many of them come back saying, I need to get back on the wagon, please help me. And then these wonderful people help each other. And this is absolutely key to the success at Norwood Avenue. I think another one is that everybody has regular blood tests, so we know what's happening. We know when those hemoglobin A1Cs go up. So we're coming to the end now, and your free gift is coming up. I wonder what that free gift is. So this gift has taken me a long time to make for you all, and you can all take copies of it. And dun, dun, da, 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 here it is. Yes. So what I've done, I've made an 8th sugar infographic, and I've made this infographic for you because of the number of people that say to me, but surely brown rice is okay, or it's all right because I eat brown bread or brown spaghetti. So I went back to the data that Jeffrey Leavesey and I did, and here is the answer. So here's white rice, boiled white rice, 150 grams, brown rice. So the white rice would be equivalent to 9 teaspoons of sugar, and the brown rice 7.3. This is 2 slices of white bread is the same as 8 teaspoons of sugar. 2 slices of brown bread is like 6 teaspoons of sugar. The white spaghetti 6.6, the brown spaghetti 6.2. Just compare this to broccoli or any other green vegetable. Just see how little sugar there is in there. And the same would apply to eggs, cheese, steak, fish, all of the things we eat on the low-carb diet. So even the brown forms of carbohydrate are still significantly sugary. Now, I know that many of you will be thinking, well, what about fiber? Because fiber is really important. Fiber may well be important, but I'm very grateful just to finish with this paper, Assessing the Nutrient Intake of a Low-Carb, High-Fat Diet, by the wonderful Catherine Zinn, or is it Carolyn? Carolyn, I think it is, Carolyn Zinn, where she looked into the constituents of a well-formulated low-carb, high-fat diet. And she showed that actually the fiber content of low-carb diets can be absolutely fine. And that's because green veg is full of fiber, nuts are full of fiber, and so on. So a low-carb diet does not have to be low fiber, even though we don't have these things like brown rice and brown bread in the diet. So I hope you like your present, and you're taking photos of it now. Some of these other infographics have gone all over the world. Some of the most popular ones have been downloaded millions of times, and all 7 of them are on the Public Health Collaboration website. And that brings me really to the end of my presentation. And I'd just like to finish on a word about the Public Health Collaboration. It's a charity, and 16 of us set it up years ago now, trying to improve the quality of advice pertaining to public health. It is a charity. We depend upon your donations. We wouldn't be able to run these things or do anything if you don't donate. So please, please, if my talk has been at all interesting, and if you like my gift, please donate to the Public Health Collaboration. Thank you so much, and goodbye.